In terms of the background of the event, thinking earlier that ethics is just so topical. I was speaking to some of the MBA students here earlier, and it's now taught almost most MBA courses will have something, a very substantial element on ethics. 10 years or 15 years ago, it would have been, the leading schools would have had it, but it would have been a smaller version. Certainly it's extremely topical, and there's many reasons for that. What do we define as ethics? Its relation to how bad the severity of something is. So on the first point, I was thinking about an example where back in the 80s, Michael Jackson was chastised, somewhat by a lot of people for wanting to change the color of his skin. Essentially, that was the topic, that he has black skin, he wants to change it to white skin, why? And many people would jump on the bandwagon and say it's very bad, etc. However, at the same time, even today, many people go on holidays in the heat, and they quite like, at least from the West, to have a tan. There's a different version in Asia. Many people have an umbrella, they don't want to get a tan. But it's the same concept. When we go for a tan, people say, they comment, oh, your skin looks beautiful, because it's changed color. It's a smaller extent. They haven't gone to such length as what Michael Jackson did, but it seems so alien when someone actually goes to such a length to do something. So this is a classic case of extent. Various people, there's breaches and there's huge scandal breaches. So we really want to try and understand today when we say be ethical, operate in an ethical way, what do we really mean by that? If we look at history, we've got some of the statistics here. Since 2008 and the banking crisis, the top 20 global banks were fined a total of $235 billion. Substantial amount of money. And historically, that's never ever seen before, even considering the factors of inflation. That's actually every year, if you narrow it down to, that's twice the revenue of arguably one of the leading edge companies, Google, today. That's the total amount of fines per year that banks have been paying. The other topic that I find very interesting and I particularly want to hear about is the tendency that we have to repeat things. So lessons don't tend to be learned. These things do tend to become almost habits, unfortunately, of companies and individuals in some cases. VW, interestingly, they did the same thing, the engine rigging, back in 1973. And back then, they were only asked to pay $120,000, which today would seem minuscule. In 73, that was a huge amount of money. So it's not mentioned, but it's a repetition. We also have the topic of incentivization psychology, so particularly important in the banking sector where incentives are to take a bigger risk appetite. So that's changing, I would say, in some way. However, the human tendency to want to do that and the habit that's formed over the years of doing that is still quite ingrained, which is why compliance and risk are finding more of a challenge to address these things. We then have the whole topic of the legal industry, because today, again, is not just about the contemporary, it's about marrying the ancient principles. So if you take into account a form of punishment to rectify or to try and impose the right kinds of behavior or eradicate that kind of behavior, the legal industry essentially is set up because of misbehavior in some way or other. In terms of accidents, sure, but a lot of it is to do with misbehavior. So the legal industry in the US is worth $400 billion US, which is a substantial fee. I then did a bit of looking into what's defined as white-collar crime. That's been a topic that's been there since the early 20th century. If we look at the definition then, it was a crime committed by persons of respectability and high social status in the course of his or her occupation. So it's clearly something that concerns corporates and professionals today, even though it was a relevant topic back in those days. More developments on that, I found that an interesting tangent to go on. So we looked up white-collar crime and some of the consequences for white-collar crime, the Madoff scandal, etc., where long prison sentences were put in place for the various corporate. It's such an extreme change. On the one hand, you're living such a lifestyle, and due to some kind of breach and scandal, you're then in prison. It's barely like there's any middle ground. So I just personally found it interesting to look into some of the accounts of people who have lived in that prison life. Do they go into somewhere like Guantanamo? Probably not. Do they go into somewhere that's in between? Maybe. So the things that came up, that one of the accounts was that day tends to start at 6 a.m., which it generally does for many people in the professional industry anyway, ends at about 11 p.m., which might be slightly earlier, certainly in Hong Kong, than many. So this particular individual said that prison is a wonderful place to catch up on reading, which time is a commodity. And the guy just had from 6 to 11 to read, which was interesting. Then they also have exercise classes, regular exercise classes in a sports room, tennis courts, and various things. However, in the UK, in the US, there's a kind of loophole which says that when certain equipment in the prison is damaged, they're not allowed to repair that equipment, because it's a way of showing that if you mistreat things that you're given, you're not going to get a new set of iron barbells or something to do for the rest of the day. So they then said that if the equipment's busted, you just take an inmate and you start bench pressing the inmate, with his permission. They also had the topic that don't go for showers at night. So I think still the typical prison environment is still there in these prisons. So it's a very extreme situation, that people are placed in. A few weeks ago, the US Sentencing Commission approved a number of changes. So clearly, white-collar crime needs to be adjusted based on market activities. And some of these, they're all very reasonable. First of all, the amount loss, that's down there in the regulation, it needs to adjust for inflation. What you define as high in the private banking space may be very different to when you're talking about retail banking and the various crimes that you have there. So the corporate law aspect and the thresholds was important that they revisited. They then also looked at the victims. So the more victims there are, the more severe the punishment. And I think if you look at things like Northern Rock and various scandals where they have pension funds of, essentially citizens, that's more severe, in terms of punishment. And also the backing, on the flip side, the backing that the state would have to provide to try and rescue or have some sort of takeover take place, because the severity is more, because it impacts more people. We then also had the nature of the breach, whatever it might be. There's certain things that are more severe. Again, if you look at social demographics, you can wipe out someone's entire life savings, or you could just take away a yacht from someone who has many yachts. So the nature and the victims, that demographic was factored in, which I think is all very reasonable. In terms of white-collar crime, this was, again, very interesting. 44% of white-collar crime is to do with price lies, something to do with mis-selling of some sort where they say that it's off. So the tendency to say a lie is another thing that I'm interested to learn about, because it's not the first time now in the 21st century that people are telling lies. They're historic. I think there's a certain part, unfortunately, of this human nature, the kind of conditioning that we're used to. In order to save oneself, they're willing to go to lengths. So the price lies was a big one. We then also had unnecessary repairs, where people may have an insurance scheme and they say, all right, we're moving into a new place, and guess what? This is all very damaged and we want to claim it. At the end of it, someone has to pay for that, and that comes back to customers. So it's, again, ethics around how many people are impacted, but this just seems to be a norm. The acceptance of this tends to be a norm. So how do what we would define as, I guess, a systemic level of acceptance of that kind of lack of ethics in some way was interesting. But again, a balanced view, so there's also a case of going very, very extreme. There was someone in the martial arts community recently who commented that he doesn't really like seeing how companies are trying to make trade-offs for the bad activities that they're doing, just by doing, it's like, I'm going to chop down 20 trees, it's okay, I'll just plant another 5, it's okay, it's part of BAU. It's kind of like you punch someone, you give them a plaster. It's like, you just don't punch them in the first place. So we that balance is something that I'm sure all of us are very interested in hearing. What comprises reasonable. We then also have the concept of deliberate, whether something is deliberate or not. I'm sure many of you experienced in various countries taxi drivers, they're the first people we become suspicious of when they are either driving slow or, some of them they go slow towards a light that's changing. And you think it's green, you can make that. But if we stand still, you're going to get a bit more. But it may not be deliberate. There's a question of whether something is deliberate or an intent, because that's in someone's mind. And how do you go as far as regulating what's in someone's mind, the intent? So that's again an interesting one in terms of personal ethics. There's also how to govern all of this. Now, we're here primarily to hear about, I guess, the background, history, but for us as professionals who are operating in this space, I guess I would urge, and I'll try to do myself, is to ask the questions, what we're doing more of, what can we do more of to actually try and govern this ourselves and then through others. And the point to end my introduction is really the introduction of our speaker today. So fortunate to have Dr. Kenneth Valpey here, and the background is essentially BA in Religious Studies from the University of California, an MA in Cultural and Historical Study of Religion from the University of Berkeley, Doctor of Philosophy in the Study of Religion at Oxford University, and has been teaching various courses at the University of Florida and here back in CUHK, where Dr. Kenneth is a visiting scholar. So on that note, I'd like to join in a warm welcome for Dr. Kenneth.
Thank you very much, Prashant, for having me, and thank you all for coming. I made some notes because, I'm just not so sure about myself on this topic of business, but we'll see how it goes, and with a little help from my friends, we may have an interesting discussion. I would say, tied into Prashant's so many comments that he's made, that from the perspective of public perception of business and banks, we don't think of, when people think of business, corporate business, globalized corporate business and banking, ethics is not the first thing they think of. They don't think, oh, these people are really super ethical. These are the people that we want to follow for understanding the right and the best way to live. And I would suggest that maybe this is something of a problem which the corporate world should address in a serious way, because we understand corporations are very concerned with reputation. It seems to me that they consider reputation in a somewhat superficial way. My own training, as you've heard, is in the study of religion, and it is said among scholars of religion, that's a different sort of species. Whoops, did I do something wrong here? Does that turn off on that? Okay. Scholars of religion are a sort of strange species, but they sometimes say that religion and politics are two sides of the same coin. We know that expression, two sides of the same coin, but if you think a little about that, what is that expression saying? There's something called coin. And what is a coin? A coin is money. Money is value. So both religion and politics have to do with value. And it seems to me that's what business is very much about. So we might think of this a little bit as a sandwich: religion, politics, business. Well, I'll get back to that, and we can just reflect on that a little bit. I want to also apologize in advance. I may not say so much in terms of specifics. We should do X, Y, and Z, or business world should do X, Y, and Z, because I feel this is really quite introductory initial steps in looking from what would be a perspective most people wouldn't think of to look at for business ethics, namely the Vedic tradition. Veda comes from India, ancient India, as some of you know. And I think the interesting point to make here generally is that the literature of Veda is considered to have been composed by rishis, by sages, and they're known as seers. Seers not of temporary life, but seers of something beyond. And therefore, the news that they give is not about how to do things just for today and tomorrow and next week, but it's understood that they have some enduring visions, some enduring truths, which I believe it could be argued are worth listening to in the business world, perhaps especially in the business world. So I think my task is to, bring some essential ideas from that forward, and then from that maybe some discussion can branch out. When we talk about ethics, we tend to go toward the Greek origins of that term. So we have etikos, from which we have ethos, from which we have ethos. And ethos is originally having the sense of habit or custom. And I think this is very relevant. It's coming from Greek tradition. Now, there's a whole debate among scholars how much of Greek ideas, ancient Greek ideas, philosophy, actually filtered into Greece from India. But that's reducibility is very much emphasized in order to analyze mathematically what supposedly is going on in the world. There's one field where they have trouble applying the measuring systems of scientific inquiry, although much attempt is being done in cognitive science, and that is consciousness. What is consciousness? Who knows? What is consciousness in the Vedic understanding is very much tied in with the question, what is a person? And I would suggest that the sort of bottom line, I hate to use that expression, the basic idea is that persons are irreducible. They are not reducible to energies or particles or anything else. Persons are persons, and this has implications for ethics. Persons demand, persons expect, or persons are deserving of something we call dignity. And this leads to the second kind of general idea, and that is based in a term which I think many of you are familiar with, and that is karma. It seems to me that the Vedic idea here with regard to ethics is there is a moral order which is of cosmic dimensions. And what's interesting about this is that it functions as the finest of all precision instruments. That karma, meaning action, is a calculus which no number of mathematicians with any number of computers will ever be able to catch up to, will ever be able to anticipate. It is a precision machine of the cosmos. And that idea of karma is essential to any discussion of ethics. And this leads then to what I would suggest a way of talking about investment. And here what I want to say is that if we broaden out the concept of karma as action of all sorts. Originally, or in ancient times, the word karma referred specifically to ritual action, but then it develops into the broader sense of any action. And based on this idea, then we can understand karma in terms of investment. And here the idea is that every action, every thought, every non-action is a form of investment. And this gets us back to that definition of ethics as habit or custom, because we tend to do things, we tend to think things, or we tend to think in ways which are habitual, and this is all part of our investment in our individual future, but also in our collective future. And this might have it certainly has interesting implications with regard to correction, with punishment. You spoke of the prison system with regard to crossing over ethical lines in business. Take these 2 points about, getting ahead of myself. We take these 2 points of irreducibility of persons and the idea of karma. And this can lead us into the question of appropriate investment. Investment bankers are constantly thinking, where should we invest? Where's the best place to invest? And I would suggest that in the Indian, the Vedic system, this is where the word dharma comes into view. Making appropriate investments is dharma, and the word dharma, it's a Sanskrit word which people often translate as religion, they translate it as duty, but the root of the word dharma, means to sustain. So what can we do? How can we invest in such a way that not just my personal well-being is sustained, but everything, all of my surrounding, the world, the cosmos is sustained. That's what dharma, the understanding of dharma is bringing us to consider. And so this then leads to thinking about corporations and how corporations act as persons. Perhaps you know, a corporation is considered, when it comes to court, as a legal person. Now, some years ago, I came across a YouTube video. It was quite well done, in which the point was argued that corporations have a tendency, being corporate persons, they have a tendency toward being or to acting psychopathically. What does that mean? That means, what is a psychopath? A psychopath is someone who has absolutely no consideration of others. They see nothing beyond their own selfish need, what they think is their need, their selfish desires. So I think when we talk about ethics, what the Vedic tradition is suggesting is that we really have to question on a very deep level what exactly is going on. What is this structure called the corporation? Is there a different way of thinking of the corporate? Is it possible for the corporation as a person to be educated, to be re-educated, to act not as a psychopath, but as a person, as a healthy person? So this, not understanding this point is leading to so much in the way of unethical behavior among the corporate world. Okay, now it's time for me to do my Sanskrit quote from Bhagavad Gita. We have a solution, and that is Yat Yat Acharati Shreshtas Tat Tat Evetaro Jana Sa Yat Pramanam Kurute Lokas Tat Anuvartate. Some of you are smiling. You know this verse. It's talking about leaders. Shreshta means the best. Yat Yat Acharati, whatever the leaders are doing, Tat Tat Eva Itara Jana, the ordinary folks will follow. Sayat pramanam kurute, whatever example they give, these leaders give, lokastat anuvartate, the whole world will follow. So this suggests it's from Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the sort of core texts of what we call Vedic, broadly speaking, Vedic literature. This is focusing on the leaders. Who are the leaders of corporations? The CEO. And what are the CEOs of corporations doing? I just read yesterday that the top 100 CEOs in the US have retirement funds for themselves equal to the total amount of retirement money saved by 41% of the US population. Is that a good example for CEOs? That some of them have, in their retirement fund over 200 millions, billions, it's just phenomenal. I can't remember the numbers, over my head. Such phenomenal. What are they going to do with that money? What could they possibly do with that money? Someone is getting, I forget now, X number of millions of dollars per month. What do you do with that kind of money? What kind of example is that that's being given? Okay, so it seems to me that CEOs, they could use some education. If there are some CEOs here, I'm speaking to you. And this reminds me, it's not in my notes, but it reminds me of something else I read. There's a Unitarian minister of Seattle, Washington, wrote a famous book. His name is Robert Furgum. Wrote a very famous book, sold millions of copies, called something like Anything Important That I Learned in Kindergarten. And he lists in his introduction, he has a little list of the things that he learned in kindergarten. And the first thing he learned was share everything. Right? Simple point, but somehow it gets lost. We become very, sophisticated. Okay, now this leads to a discussion of responsibility, and the English word responsibility, I think, is kind of interesting. We have responsibility. We have an ability to respond. And if we have an ability to respond, what is that ability? First of all, it's the ability to say yes or no to a particular opportunity. And this makes it possible for us to think about sustainability. We have an ability to sustain the world, to sustain our business, and so on, if we take responsibility. And how this might be done is actually being discussed on many levels. This is not something, suddenly now we bring Vedic ethics and, we never thought of that. No, this is, sort of basic ethics that we may be familiar with. But the idea of dharma, the idea of karma, which extends an understanding of action and proper investment, I think can make this discussion deeper. One example of what's being done, I work with the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies at Oxford University, and one of the initiatives in which our center was involved was the creation of the Dow Jones Dharma Index. This is an index, a listing of companies which someone who wants to do business, wants to make investments, it's to help that person to make decisions what to invest in and what not to invest in based on their understanding of Dharma. This was done in cooperation with scholars not only of Hinduism but also of Buddhism. And they had basically four areas of focus. From the Hindu side was the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence, and the concept of loka sangraha, protecting the world. This is also mentioned in Bhagavad Gita. From the Buddhist side was the notion of metta, which means in Sanskrit maitra, which means loving kindness, and karuna, which means compassion. So with these four principles, then discussion begins on creation of this index. This happened in 2006, and you can go on the OCHS website to read something more about that. A similar idea comes with, or related to this, is divestment, convincing those who have invested in a particular area, for example, fossil fuel business, considering its effect on climate change. One statistic I found, 800 individuals and institutions have been persuaded to divest $50 billion from fossil fuel companies. Now, the total investment in fossil fuel is vastly more than that. It's a drop in the bucket. But still, it signals something. It calls attention. And some of the organizations that divested from these investments were Stanford University, the World Council of Churches, the Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, of course, we can be cynical and say, well, they're just concerned about their reputations. Okay, but maybe that's a beginning. At least maybe they're doing the right thing. Well, I'm watching the clock, and I think I need to move on to the marriage topic. I don't know, I'm not much of a matchmaker, but let's see how it goes. Okay, an American economist of about a generation ago, Kenneth Boulding, spoke of three forms of power. Threat power, exchange power, and love power. This is an economist who's talking about love power. And he argued that of the three forms of power, love power is the strongest. Isn't that nice? Now you may say, oh, now he's going to get all soft and, talk about soft things and so on. Well, yes, maybe. But we're talking about marriage, and in marriage, what should there be aside from affection, or in addition to affection? There should be respect, isn't it? So getting back to the point about irreducibility of persons, seems this is our starting point. Persons are to be respected, and that needs to be learned, and that's something that we all learn in the beginning of our lives. Very early on, we learned the mechanics of respect. It's not actually a virtue to be polite. It's preliminary to virtue to be polite. On the basis of being polite, we can interact among humans and the various virtues can be exercised. But this consideration of three sorts of power, this brings me back to this point of two sides of the same coin, religion, politics, and business in the middle. They seem to all be sort of bound together, but what is the binding force? The Vedic tradition would say that it is this sense of love. And this is tied into an essential notion, which is that life is sacred. When we understand that all life is sacred, then that becomes the basis for ethical activities on all levels. Finally, I'll just mention Adam Smith, another economist from the 18th century. He was a political economist. He said that of all characteristics of being human, the essential characteristic is sympathy. This is, again, an economist. And we find ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, in a situation where we're in tension between a tendency toward animality, being animal, which means immediately responding to our animal desires, on the one side, and on the other side we have the idea of, or we sense a threat of super rationality. Now, in the business world, the finance world, you're dealing all the time with computers, isn't it? And the computers are, what are they doing? They're computing numbers. They have no feeling. They have no sense of sympathy. And yet, we put so much emphasis on the mathematics. We want to see the bottom line profit. But we understand that term profit only in the most limited ways. And what I want to say is we need to expand that notion of profit. Now I want to end with a quote from Bertrand Russell, a mathematician, a well-known philosopher, mathematician in the UK in the early 20th century. This is what he says about mathematics. Thus, mathematics may be defined as the subject in which we never know what we are talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true. That's Bertrand Russell on mathematics. So we've invested a lot of faith in mathematics, and yet here's Bertrand Russell saying maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe instead we should think more deeply about what is actual wealth, what is actual value. In Sanskrit, the word artha means value, and it also means meaning. I think that's an interesting relationship. The question for all of us as human beings is, what does my life mean? And we understand that in terms of value, and that value facilitation is what we want to make in the process or in the practice of making business. So it seems to me. And it seems to me that if we think in these ways, it may be possible to do good business, which is really based on genuine ethics. Thank you very much.
You raised the question of sympathy as being an essential human characteristic.
Yes.
But I wonder about that because, I don't know, we see sometimes even animals have sympathy for other animals.
Yes, elephants. Well, this was Adam Smith. But I think even if it's not exclusively to human beings, it does point to personhood. What we do see in such animals which exhibit sympathy is what we might call evidence of personhood. I read recently that it's been officially declared in India that porpoises are persons. I don't know on what level, government level, whatever it was, but porpoises are persons. And I think this is the real point, that recognition of this quality, perhaps initially among human beings, but then extending it out to other species, enables us as human beings to act in appropriate ways with all species. To me, in our context of talking about business, suggests the interesting topic of debt forgiveness, which has an ancient tradition, not in India, but in the Middle East. The Jewish tradition, they have, rules. You perhaps know better than I, that what is it, every 7 years, debts are canceled, and then every 50 years, that's where we get the word jubilee, or 49 years, every 49 or 50 years. I don't know exactly how that works, but debt forgiveness is part of that ancient system. So how could that be developed or recovered as an understanding in the modern financial world? That might be something for further discussion. Yes. Right.
Can the Vedic perspective provide further answers to that? Or does it stick to the utilitarian approach where you do good things, you get some good results, and therefore try to be nice?
Very nicely put, thank you. Well, indeed, in one sense, I ended where one might want to then proceed to part two, where you do have a term for, let's say, the non-calculative action, and that is bhakti. And bhakti is translated usually as devotion, but it also means to share, from the verbal root bhaj, which means to share, but to share in a non-calculative sense. And I think the sort of short answer to your question is one may find oneself in a particular situation, apparently boxed in, I have to act in this way, or I lose my job. One can at the same time take it upon oneself that let me, despite how I must act in this condition, develop within myself a culture which can lead to an understanding whereby I may meet up with others of similar sympathies, similar understanding. We might venture out and develop a business model which would not be for, shall I say, being like sharks in the deep sea. Sometimes people will say, well, you know, if you're if you're out in the ocean and it's all sharks out there, what are you going to do? You're going to have to be a shark yourself. I think here the point of karma comes in that the Vedic tradition would say, well, if you are investing your thinking ways to act in such a way as a shark, then do not be surprised if in a next life or the next life you become a shark, literally. So if someone says, well, I'm sorry, I just have to, you know, act like a shark. I'd like to be soft and so on, but I'm just, you know, it's a cutthroat world, so yeah, fine. So then we understand that in the course of one's life, which continues beyond this life, one will receive that form of life which is most appropriate for one's behavior according to this calculus of karma. But yes, above and beyond this calculus of karma, there is, we can say, a higher dharma, and that is articulated especially with the term bhakti. And it is an interesting consideration how to bring these two together, the real world of, you know, business, finance, and so on, and this idea of, as Kenneth Boulding says, love power. How can that work? How can that work in a day-to-day business environment? That's something for discussion.
Just a follow-up question on what was asked right now. So, how do you decide to draw? Like, how do the Vedas tell us to, you know, make a line as to what is acceptable when it comes to business and what is not acceptable? I mean, even let's say, you know, you can be. I mean, every sort of job that you're doing is like, you know, maybe at microbial levels or something, but it is harming something else. Because if you're gaining something, there is a loss happening somewhere else. Even if it's like, you know, somewhere.
If somebody gains, somebody else loses.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
Not just another human. Maybe, you know, let's say if you're going somewhere for mechanical jobs or something, you know, the environment's getting hurt, etc. So how do you decide where to draw a line?
Well, some decisions we make individually, and some we do make collectively. And so much of what we would be confronted with in present-day business environment might not be spelled out in ancient Vedic literature. That's why I kept myself to these very broad principles. And to sort of take the next step, it's actually something which I've been also doing some very preliminary talking with a few colleagues in Europe and America, that we want to start some discussions going on Vedic ethics broadly conceived, and then working towards specific areas, including business. So I can't say very much specific right now, but it seems to me that one place to look is in, there are many genres of Vedic literature, and one of them is the narrative, especially the epic literature. Perhaps you know, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are the two sort of core epic literatures of India. And the whole story of the conflict in the Mahabharata between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, you can see this that decisions are being made, and in one sense, in the center of all the decisions being made from the Kaurava side, these are the ones who represent the greedy, aggressive, unethical, unprincipled persons. At the core of all this is, or at the center of all this, is one person who is blind. Dhritarashtra is blind. It's understood in the narrative he's not only physically blind, but he's also emotionally, ethically blind. So it seems that what the Vedic literature, again, broadly speaking, is saying is step number one, wake up. Open your eyes and widen your perspective to see that indeed there are consequences for everything we do, and the consequences start with ourselves. And with that, then one decision can lead to more meaningful decisions.
What are you trying to suggest in terms of ethics? Is it what is it that is going to drive ethics being followed by corporate? Is it the individual's spiritual kind of attainment or gains through this calculus of dharma, or are you saying that following those ethics will as an investment will help them achieve their own gains in some way through reputation and through competition? I mean, or is it that individual belief in this dharma and getting his spiritual attainment or his gain through this dharma practice is going to drive the ethics to be followed by the corporates?
It may not initially be what drives it, but the suggestion is that it could very well, because the irreducibility of the person is there, and the possibility that there has to be sustained a notion of hope that all persons can take seriously, that they can learn to understand what is actually valuable for themselves individually. Initially, the driving force is bound to be, the surface concerns, reputation and so on. But I think if we start with this understanding, what is the concern of reputation? It's only persons who have reputations. The corporate person, and we as persons involved in a corporation participate in that reputation. But ultimately, we want to get back to what are the real values, and that means ourselves individually, and make that, I would say, the driving force. But it's the CEOs especially who should be doing this to give example. Yat acharati sheshta.
Just something to add on is, I think I heard that somebody mentioned that what can we do in banking and finance, for example, which can lead to a more ethical outcome. Things like graphene banking, for example, was a very, very big initiative, and it's done wonders for microfinance.
Sorry, I missed one word you said. Things like?
Grameen banking.
Grameen, oh, okay, yes.
It is a very good example of the financial world, which brings about kind of an ethical, kind of a good karma change, and it produced good results. And then, like, the paybacks are much better than...
So microfinance.
Yes.
So
nice. It's just something which can be done. It's a creative idea, but I'm sure there must be 10,000 other ones, which is still to be discovered.
Yeah, there are also initiatives in terms of indexes. I mentioned the Dharma Index, Dow Jones. There's also, I came across the FTSE for Good index. A lot of such things are there. So creativity, you mentioned, yes, I think some creativity is required. But it has to come, it has to be driven by a bigger vision.
So I think I certainly would echo some of those questions. And I think Chandrash's question at the end was particularly good. That what does it mean for us tangibly? I think sometimes when you have a very big problem, it's not easy to dissect what the next steps is. And I think that's true with every problem or every organization. I think it's also important to note that if you take the examples of certain individuals, and they're not the only ones, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, clearly very extreme examples of people who have literally individually removed themselves and started doing different things. I think we can quite safely say that not many of us are in a position where we're able to do something like this. But what does it mean in terms of our organizations? What can we really take away? And I think, like you mentioned, Dr. Kenneth, there are starting to be roots sprouting in that direction. Various organizations and individual level, for example, where they're encouraging more yoga, for example, a simple thing like a bit of meditation at lunchtime or something, like a bit of stretching, even being more considerate to like mothers, who are in the workplace, etc. So there has been a bit of a paradigm shift. And I think companies are slowly realizing that ethical investments are definitely something they should venture into. So I think the main thing to note, like you did note, Dr. Kenneth, we won't be giving specifics. So I think the first step of solving a big problem begins with knowledge of what the right thing to do is. How much of those steps you can take is another thing, but at least awareness that actually this may not be so good, this is better. Just a simple awareness, and then it may propagate to more awareness, which then may lead to actions, may or may not. But I think these are all bite-sized steps. I think we must have read about various Japanese executives where obviously principles need to be taken cohesively, the whole lot. It's not like you can do one act that's amazing and then you counter it with various other ways. I'm going to do one thing that's very ethical. But other Japanese executives have accepted a very, very low paycheck, that's much lower for chief executives than most people in the organization. So we definitely see, bits of that. It's just a case of working out as a group what is comprehensively, appropriate, as we said earlier. So.